Emma had always felt safe in her small town, where everyone knew everyone, and the nights were quiet. She lived alone in a quaint cottage on the edge of the woods, a place that had been in her family for generations. It was an old house, creaky and full of character, but it had always felt like home, until the night it didn't. It started with the strange noises. For the past week, Emma had been hearing faint scratching sounds at night, coming from outside her bedroom window. At first, she dismissed them as tree branches brushing against the glass, or maybe an animal in the garden. But the more she listened, the more she realized that the sounds were too deliberate, too rhythmic to be natural. One night, unable to sleep, Emma decided to investigate. She grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the window. The air outside was still, the trees motionless. She shone the light into the darkness, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Relieved, she chalked it up to her imagination and went back to bed, pulling the covers tightly around her. But the noises continued. Each night, the scratching grew louder, more insistent. Emma's unease grew with it, until she found herself dreading the approach of night. She began sleeping with the lights on, hoping the glow would keep whatever was out there at bay. But it didn't. One particularly cold night, the scratching was so loud it woke her from a deep sleep. Heart pounding, she bolted upright and stared at the window. In the dim light of her bedside lamp, she saw it, a shadowy figure standing just outside the glass, its outline barely visible through the thin curtains. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't make out any details, just a tall, dark shape that seemed to be watching her. Paralyzed with fear, she sat frozen, unsure of what to do. The scratching resumed, more frantic now, as if the figure was trying to claw its way inside. Summoning every ounce of courage, Emma reached for her phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher's calm voice did little to soothe her as she whispered her address and explained that someone was outside her window. Minutes passed, feeling like hours, as Emma kept her eyes locked on the shadow. It hadn't moved, but the scratching had stopped. A part of her wanted to believe that it was gone, but she knew better. It was still there, lurking just out of sight. Finally, the sound of sirens pierced the night. Blue and red lights flashed outside, and Emma watched as two police officers approached her house. One of them shone a flashlight around the perimeter, while the other knocked on her front door. Emma ran to the door and let them in, her hands trembling. The officers pulled back the curtains and inspected the window, but there was no sign of anyone outside. The ground beneath the window was undisturbed, no footprints in the dirt, no marks on the glass. The officers nodded, promising to patrol the area more frequently and advising her to keep her doors and windows locked. They left her with a sense of unease that did nothing to alleviate her fear. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the safety of her home had been stripped away. That night, sleep eluded her entirely. Every creak of the house made her jump. Every gust of wind sounded like the scratching. She kept her eyes on the window, half expecting the shadow to return. And it did. At exactly 3 a.m., the scratching resumed. This time it was accompanied by a low, raspy whisper. Emma's blood ran cold as she realized the voice was speaking her name. Without thinking, she grabbed her flashlight and ran outside. The cold night air bit at her skin, but she didn't care. She needed to see it, to confront whatever was tormenting her. She rounded the corner of the house, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. But there was nothing there. The whispering stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that made her skin crawl. Emma slowly backed away, her heart racing, when suddenly she felt a cold hand grip her shoulder. She screamed, and spun around, but there was no one behind her. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. Panic set in, and she ran back inside, slamming the door behind her. She was shaking uncontrollably, her mind racing. Had she imagined it all? Was she losing her grip on reality? Emma didn't sleep that night, or the night after. The shadow never returned to the window, and the voice never whispered her name again. But the fear stayed with her, a constant companion in the silence of her home. A week later, she packed a suitcase and left the cottage, vowing never to return. But as she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. And she knew deep down that it was only a matter of time before the shadow found her again. Emma had hoped that leaving the cottage would bring her peace, but the sense of dread followed her wherever she went. She rented a small apartment in a neighboring town, trying to put distance between herself and the memories of that terrifying night. But even in the safety of her new surroundings, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The first few nights in her new place were relatively calm. Emma slept with the lights on, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, ready to dial for help if needed. But no scratching came, and no shadowy figure appeared at her window. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe that whatever had haunted her was tied to the old cottage, that she was finally free. But the peace was short-lived. One night, as she was getting ready for bed, Emma noticed something strange in the mirror. As she brushed her hair, she saw a faint movement behind her, like a shadow passing by the doorway. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly approached the door, peering into the hallway. It was empty. She tried to convince herself it was just a trick of the light, but the unease crept back in. Emma double-checked the locks on her doors and windows, but sleep eluded her that night, her mind replaying the image of the shadow in the mirror. The following day, Emma threw herself into work, trying to distract herself from the growing fear. She spent long hours at the office, surrounded by colleagues and the comforting hum of activity. But even in the daylight, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She felt eyes on her, watching from the corners of the room, just out of sight. Her co-workers noticed her unease. "You okay, Emma?" one of them asked during lunch. Emma forced a smile. "Yeah, just not sleeping well lately." "If you need to talk, we're here for you," her friend said, concern evident in her voice. "Thanks, I appreciate it," Emma replied, though she knew there was no way to explain the terror she was experiencing without sounding crazy. The days passed in a blur, and the nights became increasingly unbearable. The shadow returned, appearing more frequently in the reflections of mirrors and windows, always just out of reach. It never directly confronted her, but its presence was suffocating. Emma felt as though it was toying with her, pushing her closer to the edge. One night, the whispering returned. Emma had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when she heard it, soft at first, then gradually growing louder. It was the same low, raspy voice that had haunted her at the cottage, but this time, it was clearer, more menacing. "Emma, I found you." Her blood ran cold. She sat up, clutching the sheets to her chest, her eyes darting around the room. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the walls. "Emma, you can't hide." Terrified, Emma bolted from the bed and ran to the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind her. She flicked on the light and backed against the wall, breathing heavily. The whispering stopped, leaving only the sound of her own ragged breathing. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, trying to calm herself. But as she watched, the lights began to flicker. The bathroom filled with a dim, pulsating glow, and the reflection in the mirror started to change. It wasn't her own face staring back at her anymore. It was a twisted, shadowy version of herself, its eyes hollow and dark. The reflection smiled, a sinister grin that sent shivers down her spine.
Emma, I'm inside you.
Emma screamed and smashed the mirror with her fist, shattering the glass into a million pieces. The light flickered one last time before going out completely, plunging the bathroom into darkness. She stumbled out of the bathroom, her hand bleeding from the broken glass, and collapsed onto the floor of her bedroom. The whispering had stopped, but the silence was even more terrifying. She felt as though the shadow was inside her mind, rooting itself deep within her. For the next few days, Emma avoided mirrors and reflective surfaces, too afraid to see what might be lurking in them. She began to unravel, her fear consuming her every thought. She started seeing the shadow everywhere, in the corners of rooms, in the darkness outside her window, in the faces of strangers on the street. It followed her, a constant presence that she couldn't escape. Desperate, Emma decided to seek help. She visited a therapist, hoping that talking about her experiences might bring some relief. But even as she sat in the therapist's office, recounting her story, she felt the shadow watching her, lurking just out of sight. The therapist listened patiently, but Emma could see the doubt in her eyes. "It sounds like you've been under a lot of stress," the therapist said. "Sometimes our minds can play tricks on us when we're overwhelmed. Have you considered taking some time off work? Maybe getting away for a while?" Emma nodded, but she knew deep down that getting away wouldn't help. The shadow had followed her from the cottage. It would follow her anywhere she went. That night, Emma decided to confront the shadow once and for all. She couldn't live in fear any longer. She needed to take control. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of determination, she waited in the dark, listening for the familiar whisper. It didn't take long. The clock struck 3 a.m., and the scratching began. Emma's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. She switched on the flashlight and pointed it toward the source of the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the corner of the room where the shadow had appeared before. But there was nothing there. The scratching continued, louder now, more frantic. Emma followed the sound, moving the flashlight around the room, but she still couldn't see anything. "Show yourself," she demanded, her voice trembling. The scratching stopped abruptly, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, the voice returned, closer than ever. "I'm here, Emma." She spun around, shining the flashlight in every direction, but the room remained empty. Panic set in as the whispering grew louder, more menacing. It was everywhere, surrounding her, closing in. "Emma! Emma!" The voice was right behind her. She could feel the cold breath on the back of her neck. In a final act of desperation, Emma whirled around and swung the flashlight, hoping to hit something, anything. But there was nothing there. The light flickered and died, leaving her in complete darkness. The voice whispered in her ear, sending chills down her spine. "You can't escape me," Emma screamed, dropping the flashlight and running blindly through the darkness. She crashed into furniture, stumbled over objects, but she kept running, desperate to get away from the voice, from the shadow that haunted her. She reached the front door and fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Finally, she managed to throw the door open and stumbled outside, into the cold night air. But the shadow followed her. Emma ran down the street, her bare feet pounding against the pavement. She didn't know where she was going. She just needed to get away. The voice echoed in her mind, taunting her, driving her to the brink of madness. "You can't run from me, Emma." She kept running, tears streaming down her face until she reached the edge of the woods. Without thinking, she plunged into the trees, the branches tearing at her clothes and skin. The darkness of the woods swallowed her, but she kept running, driven by fear and desperation. The whispering grew fainter as she ventured deeper into the woods, but it never disappeared completely. It was as if the shadow was toying with her, letting her think she could escape before closing in again. Finally, exhausted and terrified, Emma collapsed at the base of a large tree. She was panting, her body trembling from the cold and fear. The woods were silent, but she knew the shadow was still out there, waiting. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing, trying to gather her thoughts. But the silence was shattered by a familiar sound, the scratching. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. Emma's eyes snapped open, and she looked around frantically, but she couldn't see anything in the darkness. Then she heard the voice. "Emma, you're mine." It was right next to her, as if the shadow had finally caught up with her. She felt the coldness envelop her, felt the darkness closing in.
No!
She screamed, pushing herself to her feet and stumbling forward. But her legs gave out, and she fell to the ground, her vision blurring. The shadow was all around her now, its presence suffocating. "You can't escape, Emma." She felt the cold breath on her neck again, felt the darkness seeping into her mind. It was inside her, rooting itself deep within her soul. Emma's screams echoed through the woods, but no one was there to hear them. The shadow closed in, and everything went black.